We don't want hydrogen. We do not want hydrogen cars because they're extremely dangerous. You're not recognizable if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong and Marjorie Taylor Greene with that beautiful blonde hair is driving down the highway in a hydrogen car, and the problem with a hydrogen car, if something goes wrong, it's like the atom bomb went off. You're not recognizable. But they say, we think we have it under control. That's not good enough. They'll say, we thought it was Marjorie Taylor Greene riding down the middle of the turnpike, but she's no longer recognizable. We found some of her. I won't say. We love her. Stand up. Marjorie, stand up.
Stand up, Marjorie. What the hell was that?
Something else.
That's our boy in top form as this campaign 2024 rounds the final stretch. And we're going to find out who it is. But I don't know how hydrogen came up. It's interesting sort of angle to take when you're taking money from Elon Musk, whose vehicles explode in sort of extravagant fashion as well.
No, I mean he really is on a whole other level. I think he right now this Trump is like some QBs, hate to say it, people like Tom Brady. Doesn't matter how the season's going. It's like right once you're in the playoffs, it's like it's time to go. That's Trump with the riffs when we get into late October here.
That's true. Although he might be in his sort of Aaron Rodgers Jets era.
Maybe.
But it's close. They still might win. Jets still won a couple games this season. So.
You never know. I mean, I think they might be done, but I don't have much room to talk as a Cowboys fan. But we're not going to do that. We're going to talk. We got a lot to get to today. Actually, we have a full-on, jam-packed left reckoning for everybody. We're going to be taking a visit to Nebraska and talking about this Dan Osborn race. Where for people who aren't familiar, Dan Osborn is an independent for Senate. Union leader, somebody who has really, I think, opened up a lot of doors, at least proving an idea that working class politics can win across the country. Really looking forward to diving deep in that with Austin in just a little bit. And then after that, I'm going to review. We're going to drop the conversation we had with Paul Reitter and Paul North, who are the translators and editors of this really exciting new edition of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. It's a really, really interesting new edition of this work. I highly suggest getting your hands on it if you haven't already. There's links below, and we'll talk about why. One, you should be reading Capital and Marx in the first place, but also why there was a need for a new translation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to that full thing. I've seen quite a bit of it, and I like the
sounds like somebody when they're talking about whether or not they've read Capital. There's like, I've skimmed some bits of. I've read excerpts, right?
Yeah, but I do like the variation. We're going very like not a local election; it's a statewide election in Nebraska. But I will say I'm very glad for Dan Osborn's campaign to have something besides. I think it's maybe one of the most morbid campaign seasons I can remember. I'm sure they all have a little bit of this, but Osborn is at least genuinely interesting, and the anxieties he's sort of surfacing are a little bit interesting to me, especially because it's not like there's a Democrat there.
Yeah,
right. Like that would be nice.
It kind of proves something that we've been saying on this program for a while, is that there's a lot of libs out there who are pretty afraid of of what a working class politics might look like in this case.
Yeah, actually, I didn't want to put words in Austin's mouth, but I do think that that's some of the anxiety we're seeing. Is like it would be that there could be a chance that he just caucuses with Republican or so whatever. I doubt that. I think there's some people that are afraid of the chance that he is actually a better senator than most that we have elected. So we'll see.
Well, before we get to those conversations, Matt, we want to talk a little bit about this election. I mean, there's a few things we can get to, maybe to warm us up a little bit. This might be my favorite video of the entire campaign season. It's been really interesting. The folks that Trump has sort of decided to associate himself with in this election. And one who just is completely perplexing to me. Because look, I mean, he's a nasty guy, but like, Hulk Hogan's a little funny, exciting on the stage there. But Musk giving this guy as much attention as they have has been something truly, truly fascinating to me. But yeah, let's see this a little bit.
Yeah. USA, 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 USA. Wah! Yes. USA. Wah! Yes.
I think we might need to get that as a sound drop.
USA. He says it like a Canadian.
I mean, yeah, not to be too jingoistic, but no, and I gotta say, like I would be very mad if I was Trump too about all these guys who are trying to wear Trump branded stuff, but they're very, very disrespectful, right? Because they feel like they're better than the rest of of MAGA. They think they're better than the rest of MAGA. They're not going to wear the red hat. They have to come up with their own special branding, be it this black hat, the other ones that we've been seeing on Musk's head, or the incomprehensible RFK Maha movement.
Yeah, I'm curious how what the intellectual property situation is on Dark MAGA. Are all the contributions going to Trump? I'm searching Dark MAGA hat. I'm just going to see if we can the official Dark MAGA hat. So that is Trump National Committee. I mean, who knows if these links are scam? But $40.
Beautiful. Well, yeah. I mean, we have some other clues we'll get to in a second, but I mean, Matt, how are you feeling a week out? Other than being excited for it to be over soon.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't feel great about any of the content of the campaign, major campaigns. In terms of like who's going to get over the finish line, I don't have a very strong sense. Trump doesn't seem super strong to me. Kamala also seems not strong, and running away from base toward some sort of imaginary person who loves both democracy and Liz Cheney. But I don't think that just because I don't like that means I can't win. I think maybe she's favored slightly. I don't think it should be close. But yeah, I don't know. And I also don't think I think Osborn, I would love if Osborn won. I have a better chance in him than Allred. I kind of don't expect the Senate generally to stay tied with the VP tiebreaker. And I don't have a greater sense of the House either. But I don't know. I'm not super optimistic going into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the fundamental realities and the feeling of pessimism that you have, is apart from Osborne. I mean, a real absence of a political movement and a political field that was a big part of like you and I getting to know each other, and a lot of the audience here, which was the Democratic Socialist political movement. I mean, that's for the most part. Obviously, like Bernie's still involved, AOC's still involved, but they're not involved as standard bearers of this alternative politics. They're very, very much enforcers of people like Kamala Harris. That they've made their decision about they think that the threats of Trump are what they are. But regardless if you agree or disagree with that strategy, the fact of the matter is that an alternative politics is just not on the table. I mean, the fact that we're not talking about things like Medicare for all. Hell, we're not even able to have like a serious conversation on the national level about whether or not the United States government should be engaged in the mass slaughter of children and egging on an entire regional war, to defend the racist state of Israel.
Yeah, and I don't. I'm trying to think of who I'll vote for in New York, but I'm not. I'm not unreservedly thrilled about, frankly, any of the options. It won't be for Jill Stein. I can say that. I'm not going to cast a vote for Greens. Probably PSL. I'm a member of DSA. They don't have a presidential candidate. Maybe I write in Jamal Bowman.
Yeah, I mean, the pessimism is felt across the board, and I think that regardless of what happens next week, I think that like the real focus has to be how can we reinvigorate, a sustained political working class movement, because I think that that has kind of fallen off the table. I think there's been a lot of things that have happened over the past 4 years. There's a lot of movements that are in existence, but something that is like actually like a center of struggle against both of these really really bad options. It has to be reinvigorated. We're seeing things like DSA, which you and I are both members of. What we're seeing that movement's on the decline. There's exciting things in New York. I think that the potential of a strong socialist running for mayor in New York might be the kind of thing that galvanizes these kind of this kind of thing that we need 100%. I think you have to be in the game to win it, and I think particularly the past 2 years, I think the absence of these kind of electoral campaigns. For the most part, for like a democratic socialist movement, obviously there are incredibly exciting things here in Austin. Mike Siegel, somebody who I'm very excited about getting on the city council, but that kind of national movement, like we had, for example, with Bernie, or even with some of the progressives that were getting elected in 2020, 2022, that's kind of fallen to the wayside. And I think there's part of it that's from national leadership of the movement, the fact that it never really coalesced into a kind of proper organized structure. A lot of the dramas within DSA were sort of, playing catch up on the fact that, a lot of very kind of famous and influential people got elected to office. And then there's a question of how those people are going to relate to the movement as a whole. The point is we're in a difficult, political moment for a lot of reasons. But I think the pessimism and the despair is sort of that moment of feeling like you're just watching and not enacting, imposing your views and will on politics.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't entirely new. Biden spent a lot of 2020 saying, "If you don't like it, vote for Trump,
Yeah.
Jack," and that was him saying, and I think correctly. I mean, I guess we know correctly. I don't have questions about the 2020 election, but saying that I can sort of thumb my nose at anybody like say, what about your role in credit cards, or what about your role in mass incarceration? Say, well, look at the other guy. And it is a horrible lesson that the Democrats are learning, that they can actually win like that, because there's a point where I think a rhetorical device of saying you need to do our policy or you're going to lose.
Yeah.
And it's a problem. It's a problem if the Republicans win. Of course, we know what that problem looks like. It's an entirely another problem if the Democrats get more and more comfortable winning the Liz Cheney lane of things. And this is something that both parties have had their eye on for a long time. Nixon wanted to start a national party or something like that. Like he wanted to do a sort of centrist pivot and sort of take out the other party. And with Trump, as sort of weak as he is, and I know that's weird to say when the election
He is weak though, and I think you have to say it like that, Matt. 100%.
Yeah, and so what happens is you have these giant headwinds from, say, the Roe versus Wade decision, that it would be nice to have a party used toward, I don't know, pushing advantage not just on that issue, but also on maybe climate change. Instead, we decided to use that to try to float Biden and Harris over the line as Biden arms a genocide, to say, and it's a bad situation.
I mean, it's just the Kamala Harris campaign is a complete mystery to me. From all the things about like Walz, for example, when it was revealed that Walz was being advised by the Harris campaign to stop calling the Republicans weird, and to stop speaking off the cuff. Two things that were very very effective, and were like, well, just calling it as a horse race. But the fact of the matter is that yes, the kind of what is the final message of Kamala Harris? I mean, frankly, it's not even at this point a strong affirmative defense of like abortion rights or things like that you think are like winners for them. It's a weird call, about democracy that I think is only motivating for a particular subset of people, and that's not the masses. In fact, like talking about democracy in this way, as we've talked about, from some of the things that were reported on by many polling, organizations, including the Center for Working Class Politics, that's something that does not move the needle for most voters. In fact, some people really dislike it when you're talking about it, because it feels like a pivot to not actually talking about the issues. And, the fact that Kamala Harris has all these things that could be winners for her, among, by the way, ending her support for the genocide in Gaza. That would be a real winner for her. I think that they've sort of made a calculation that they think that they can win on this. And two, if they can win on a kind of dispassionate platform, then it says to the rich and the powerful in this country, hey, the Democratic Party is here to play ball with y'all. And that's why we get those kind of behind the scenes conversations of major donors to the Kamala Harris campaign, talking about maybe getting rid of Lena Khan. That's why we've seen this, massive spending dump, threat of a spending dump from organizations like crypto in this election, like we talked about just last week or the week before. It's pretty bleak, man.
Yeah, but the good news is it's gonna be probably in legal limbo actually a week from now. We'll just be getting the results about a week from now. We should let people know we're going to be live on Wednesday evening. Instead of the night. I'll be doing live Majority Report at the Bell House.
Well, two things, and I think let's talk a little bit more of the election, the post game, folks. You get access to that patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We have some videos and things we'll get to and take some of y'all's questions. But two quick programming notes. Yes, as Matt was just saying, he is going to be doing that event at the Bell House, so we won't be live next Tuesday. Though I think I will probably be live at some point or another. Just follow our YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter at David Griscom, or follow us at patreon.com/Left Reckoning to see when and how we do that. I'll probably be on at some point or another just to sort of get some live reaction to these results. But Wednesday, once the dust is sort of settled, we'll be able to talk, I think, a little bit more seriously about the election. Because as I've said to Matt many times, at this point, it's like, we got to see the results. Hypothesizing on this at this point is just kind of boring. But if you want to talk about how you think we should be covering it, and you are a patron, we are also going to be doing a new event for our patrons at the $10 and above level. We are going to be doing, what do we call it? We call it the Brain Trust or the War Room. We're still workshopping the name for it, but around 4 Central, so a couple hours before we go live on Wednesday, we will be holding a large conference call with our patrons, with the people who allow this show to function at the $10 and above level. So y'all be able to come in behind the scenes and chat with Matt and I about how you're feeling about the results, as much as we have them at that point, what you think that we should be doing as the left, and also as a program, Left Reckoning. I'm really looking forward to getting everyone's input there. So that will be next Wednesday for patrons at the $10 and above level before we go live on Wednesday. So a lot to look forward to.
Yeah, and Jules asked this, and I'm not sure exactly, Jules, if this answers the question, but did Kamala Harris make any progress with unions? I mean, most unions support the Dems. The Teamsters non-endorsement, like the SEU style unions, their membership is going to be much more heavily to Harris than maybe some of the like the Teamsters, where their rank and file is more Trump. But it's not really what she's emphasizing. We're not talking about the PRO Act or anything like that. Unions do what they typically do. Are doing what they typically do in a campaign season, with the Teamsters being the one flyer who occasionally is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Well, folks, we'll have a lot more to talk about that in the post-game, patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get there. But before that, I mean, man, I'm really excited to share this conversation we had on Nebraska and the Dan Osborn campaign. It's really, really something else. And also this new look at Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, which was translated by Paul Reitter and edited by Paul North and Paul Reitter. It's been a lot of fun.
But you're going to want to join that patreon.com/Left Reckoning, because Jordan Peterson is doing the thing again. And Richard Dawkins, who I have a complicated relationship with, but is the perfect kind of patience sort of burning. It's very funny. Richard, basically, well, we'll talk about it in the postgame. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
But yeah. All right, let's get to this conversation on Nebraska here.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me as ever, Dave Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Really happy to be talking about the middle of the country tonight, as we do on Left Reckoning here with Austin Ahlman. Austin is a reporter and researcher with the Open Markets Institute Center for Journalism and Liberty, and also he did this piece we're talking about tonight, In Search of the Trump-Osborn Voters in the American Prospect. Austin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, guys. It's a real pleasure.
So, Austin, we've talked Dan Osborn a number of times here, but for folks who are just catching up because the election is around the corner, who's Dan Osborn? What's he running for?
So Dan Osborn is he is an independent mechanic who is running the probably most unabashedly populist campaign, and for better or for worse, in the country right now, and probably in the last couple of cycles. So he's in Nebraska. Nebraska is a weird state with some quirks that are kind of friendly to an independent. And the reason everybody has been paying so much attention to it, obviously, is because the control of the Senate is on the line in this race. But then also it would have spillover implications all across the Midwest, where Democrats have just been getting their asses beat forever. And there's a new model for somebody who potentially can break free from that branding, it looks like, to kind of reach escape velocity.
And so how is he running? Because I've seen a little bit of anxiety from a maybe standard partisan Democrat on certain issues. Maybe we can get into some of those more in depth. But from what I can tell, a union working class guy going against the Republican is good news. Even if he did a full Christian cinema or something like that, and that's still not a Republican. Right? I don't know, talk about this.
Well, no, so that's part of the thing, right? Is no matter how you slice it on any issue, the guy's an upgrade. Even if it's a modest upgrade, you can argue about some of the, particulars. There's really no place in his platform, and especially in the rhetoric he uses on the trail, even if you are worried about some of the commercials, that's one thing. But the rhetoric that he's using on the trail and the actual issue positions he's staked out are all, frankly, better than your average milquetoast Democrat. Or on the issues where he's made concessions, it's the standard swing state Democrat line on a lot of these things. And so there's been a lot of anxiety, is a good word to use, around him. But I think a lot of it's misplaced, and a lot of it is kind of overcorrection based off of vibes versus the actual things that he's been saying, especially on the stump.
The main thing is immigration, as far as I've seen so far. And I just think it's wild that, Kamala Harris is running a campaign where she is granting and reifying all the premises of the right wing on the border, and you expect a guy like that to not buy into that sort of wind and any phrase. If he was a socialist, I would have a bigger problem with it. He's running as an independent working class guy, and I think just tell us what he said on immigration. He's basically said he did an ad where he basically said the Washington has got in the way of Trump, and if you want someone to help build the wall, I got some tools here for you.
Well, I think the best way to understand his immigration position is to understand what he wasn't saying 6 months ago versus what he's been saying in the closing weeks of the campaign, right? So in the early stretches of the campaign, you could tell this was an issue that he was comfortable moderating his image on. It was not central to his messaging. He was much more leaning into all the, populist economic stuff, supporting labor unions, et cetera. The turning point was when he started getting hammered on immigration. A lot of this is reactive, not proactive. I don't think that it's correct to say that he's running to crack down on immigration. I think that he understands this is his biggest vulnerability, because Nebraska, we're a lot of great things, but I don't think that we're particularly, progressive minded when it comes to immigration. I'll be quite frank. And so one of the big things that he's been hammered on is some of his comments opposing mass deportations, saying that that's unfeasible, et cetera, things like that. And so reactive to that, especially as the money has poured in these last few weeks, you have seen some ads that are certainly not ads I would ever approve of if I was on the campaign with him, but saying things to the effect of, we can definitely build a border wall, my opponent has failed to secure the border, things like that. And the thing that he usually points to is the standard Democratic line, frankly, which is Republicans sank this border bill, which is a bill that I have feelings about, but they probably don't match the general electorate in Nebraska, if I'm being quite honest.
Well, and I'm sorry, I have to throw in here too that remembering the national context. I mean, in the way that Dan Osborn gets sort of talks oh, we're gonna, he's gonna be the next Joe Manchin if he gets elected. I'm sorry, like when we have here in Texas Colin Allred, who like is very much like running on being the next Joe Manchin, on being the most conservative Democrat to get elected. You know, it's just like, it's a kind of hard for me to listen to that kind of complaint about Dan Osborn, because whatever you want to say about some of that messaging, it's not out of line actually with a lot of the moves that we're seeing across the Democratic parties, elected officials and candidates for office in this cycle.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my understanding is that he's intimated he's against mass deportations, supports, and he's been a little iffy on wanting to talk about it a lot lately, but supports a pathway to citizenship, talks about things like improving the asylum process, streamlining things like that. Like, it's very, the issue positions themselves, I think, are not really the problem. And if you take issue with it, you do, like you just said, have to take issue with the broader party and how they are talking about those things. He's just modulating his rhetoric to match a different audience, and that's the important thing to realize here.
Well, I was just saying, like, you know, we're talking a little bit about the attacks against him, and we can get more into those in a minute. But like, I want to talk about why it is that, like, you know, you're finding this race interesting, why we've been finding this race interesting. Matt, I don't know if you remember this, but back in the day, because and Austin, if you could give us a little bit of his bio, but for people who've been listening to Left Reckoning over the years, y'all will remember that during the Kellogg strike, you know, Matt, we were on YouTube live with Osborn when they were doing the picket line there back in the day, right? We weren't like interfacing directly, but he was like wandering around with his webcam, and we were talking to folks. Like, that is a very interesting political trajectory for a candidate for major office in this country, where there's not that many working class people, you know, running for office. So, Austin, could you tell us a little bit about, like, you know, his background, you know, that is kind of makes him unique here?
Yeah, I mean, so he likes to say on the campaign trail, he likes to go on about how I think the figure is 2% or only 2% of our elected officials are from the working class, and how he would be the first one really in a long time in the Senate, especially because the Senate being much more elitist than the House. And he makes it quite clear that he wants to like start a movement based off these things. He wants other working class people to be able to do these things. And he points to his background as a union worker at the Kellogg's factory for years and years and years. Currently, he works at Boys Town. He was fired from Kellogg's for reasons that you can decide if you think are valid. I guess we all kind of have our opinion on that one, right? Born and raised in Omaha, never really left the state except for to serve in the military. Has interesting things to say about his military experience and how he views things like the defense budget because of it. He's just he is, to his core, if you were going to like create in a lab the perfect populist candidate to just like cut through noise and make people believe that he wants to do things to like get rid of corruption and things like that. He's that guy, you know. His tattoo sleeves down his arms. He likes to talk about how he doesn't own a suit. I mean, he lives and breathes, you know, like, I am the working man.
Well, I mean, you know, just out of curiosity, Austin, I mean, you've gone around Nebraska, you're from Nebraska. You know, could you talk about like how that has been kind of resonating with folks, and also, you know, just throw in another comparison. I will say I do have those alarm bells ringing when I hear it's like, oh, I don't wear a suit, I wear something different. I do think about John Fetterman. You know, can you make any comparisons between the two of them on that front? But also, more importantly, like, how is this resonating with people in Nebraska?
I think it's resonating a lot. So I hate to lean on family because that's always a suspicious in a thing. But I come from a family of Republicans, a lot of people that are working class, even working for Trump voters. And they all just seem to love the guy. I have never been at a family event where every member of my family was voting the same way. And I can say that changed for the very first time when I was home. And everybody was like, yeah, I'm voting for Osborn. Of course I'm voting for Dan Osborn. Who else would I be voting for except for Dan Osborn? And when you ask them, you know, that they like vibes about some of the policies, like, oh, yeah, you know, he talks about corruption, whatever. But when you get right down to it, it's kind of like I quote my uncle saying in the piece, and I was really trying to drill down, like, what do you really like about this guy? Plain and simple answer is he's a working guy, you know, and that hit, especially in the smaller and mid-sized towns. As you get out further west, you get sort of a more rancher mentality. It's not quite the same culturally. But in central Nebraska, it seemed like he was catching fire in all of the places that you would need to catch fire to get over 50%. And it's with those types of voters, just the everyday people, don't have college degrees, working in, you know, trades that are blue collar for sure. And that's where he seems like he's running up margins, or at least cutting into margins that no Democrat, I think, ever could.
I want to talk a little bit about the that sort of outreach and the Trump Osborn vote. I mean, maybe actually before I do that, Deb Fischer, where's the sentiment at with her?
Not good. So part of it, I think you have to attribute to Dan Osborn's campaign. They've done a hell of a job of driving down her favorable rating. You know, they had a message about her, which is that she is lazy, that she is bought and sold by corporate interests, and they have just hammered it for a year. And you can see, if you put a chart of her approval rating up, she just over the last year or so, and is now pretty healthily underwater. That said, she made herself vulnerable in some key ways. So in the piece, I talk about spending a day out in her home county, which is Cherry County. This is the Sand Hills. This is ranch land. And I'm just trying to look for any sign of enthusiasm whatsoever from the people that who knew her best. So this would be where she served on the school board, her former seat in the state unicameral, all in this area. She won it by like 70, 80% of the vote multiple times. And I just could not for the life of me find a single Deb Fischer yard sign. And I thought that was pretty weird because it's not like they don't put yard signs out on ranches. And in fact, they put the biggest yard signs you've ever seen. I saw dozens of state legislature race yard signs, and I just could not find any signs of enthusiasm. I interviewed, I think, 8 people total. I mentioned 3 specifically in the piece, but not anybody, not even the ones that defended her, would say anything kind about how she shows up across the state, about how accessible she is, about how in touch they are with the things that she's doing in office. And then even, The Hill, I think, had a piece a couple of days ago, or maybe it was last week sometime by this point, where even the other Republican senators were kind of just mad that she had made herself so vulnerable by not showing up and just doing basic constituent work, which is not, frankly, that hard to do in a state as small as Nebraska. If you're in a state as small as Nebraska and your constituents don't know who you are, like, you have a big problem.
And has Dan Osborn done the empty chair stunt? Because I know she's refused to debate him. Could you talk about that a little bit?
He has. So he's a very kinky campaigner in some ways that I think is kind of adorable and I know works. Like I know how people are. You can do those little stunts and they work every time. He has done the empty chair dozens of times. And I really don't know at this point what the strategy is from her part. She's not even doing real public events that are like held with notice. Reporters are finding her inaccessible. I did my darndest to just show up at an event where she was speaking, and I just could not get enough lead time to get where she was. But by the time I would find out that she's doing a public event that had maybe 20 people there, it was hours away, and there's just no way to get there in time. And then the series of appearances that I think she's done over the last week are all at county GOP events. So not really open to the public or meaningfully interfacing with the public. She is just really closed herself in there. And I honestly don't understand the strategy behind it at this point, because it has made what shouldn't be a race into a race, her actions as much as his actions and his message.
Yeah. I mean, so like, how would you describe, the campaign that he's running? Is it similar to, like, sorry to be Texas focused, but like, is it similar to like a Beto O'Rourke thing where he's like going to lots of places that maybe a non-Republican wouldn't, go typically? I mean, what's the kind of on the ground strategy? And also, how are organizations like, unions in the state sort of reacting to the campaign?
So he has a lot of support from unions. Unions have been spending on his campaign. Union members, including Republicans, have been essential to his messaging across the campaign, featured them in ads. But in general, I mean, he's running the campaign of his life. The guy is everywhere. It was not hard for me, in stark comparison to Deb Fischer, to find events where he was at any given day of the week. And he's opening campaign offices everywhere. It's not like he's just huddled down in Omaha and Lincoln. My hometown of Norfolk, which is about 25,000, a good couple hours away from any metro area. He opened a campaign office last week. He made sure to time it like when we do our downtown trick-or-treating, where all the kids from all the surrounding communities come and they go to all the businesses and they hand out candy. He made sure to open his campaign office that evening so that he could hand out candy while all the news cameras were around and everybody from the whole surrounding community was around to see him and, ham-fist it with him and all that stuff. He's just running a very smart, tactical campaign when it comes to just eking out those margins in all those places that Deb Fischer, I guess, would never dream of going.
What policies is he really hammering Fischer on? Is it corruption generally? What are the things?
It's corruption. The big one is that she is bought and sold by big ag. And that really hits in Nebraska. There's this huge, beef around, corporate farming and then small family farms are disappearing. Which one has power monetarily? Which one has public support? There's a huge disconnect between that. And especially when you map that onto our members of Congress. And he's wielded that to very deadly effect. But he's also thrown, defense contractor stuff, those contributions in there. The really big thing with her is that he says that she's bought and sold. He's found a few other things around the edges, but he is honed in on the fact that she's taken so much corporate money and that he never will, never has, never would, etc.
Our friends at I just on the messaging really quick. Our friends at the Center for Working Class Politics, and Jacobin Matt Karp have been very focused on this campaign because in a lot of ways it's sort of, proving or at least testing one of their theses is that hey, if liberals and Democrats might start writing and talking about politics a little bit differently and messaging differently, you can actually win in places that are quote unquote red states. I'm curious, how you would describe not just the policies, but the way that he kind of presents himself and speaks about these kind of issues. That is, I don't know, that is different from maybe another kind of union aligned Democrat in another state.
There's a lot more fire behind it. Number one, I think that you can just tell that he means it, which is the tangible difference that you get from an actual union leader versus just a politician that's been close with unions. I think that he also connects it to a broader theory about the economy in a way that's more effective. He talks a lot about systemic corruption. He talks a lot about corruption in Congress, the contributions of big corporations, the lack of power of unions in a very cohesive way, right? The system is rigged. You might have seen some of it that's been going around, things that's been highlighted from the stump speech, is he tells the Mouseland allegory, the Tommy Douglas story of old about a bunch of mice being ruled by cats, and they keep voting for different types of cats, hoping whatever. And he delivers the punchline very clearly that we need to stop electing goddamn cats. And that is the difference, right? It is in a way identity politics, right? We don't have to shy away from what it is. He is a working guy, clearly is not talking about this in hypotheticals. And that just comes through in all of the different ways that he connects the issues together in his stump speech. And then when he's doing Q&As and things like that.
You'll have to apologize. I have to apologize in case my attention has seemed a little bit drawn away. I'm in a fight with a Free Beacon writer about Dan Osborn now. Dan Osborn, Phil Litsu, who is Josh Hawley, a former Josh Hawley guy. Now he's National Republican Senate Counsel. Dan Osborn claims he's a lifelong independent who will fight Trump. In reality, Osborn was registered Dem his entire life, said Trump. Lost him for good in 2016. Attacked Trump as embarrassing and incompetent as recently as this year. And I'll just say, before I let you fact check some of that, the thing about Trump being embarrassing, most Trump voters admit that. They'll just say, yeah, I know his tweets. He does the tweets too much, but it's the other stuff. Who cares that he called them embarrassing? But that lifelong Democrat thing, what's your take on that, Austin?
It's fake news. No, so it is 100% fake. But the way this started, and don't quote me word for word because I don't know the exact phrasing that was used, but a few mainstream outlets, I think that it was Bloomberg and I think also the Times, misquoted him when he said something to the effect of being turned off from Democrats in 2016 to say that he was registered as a Democrat, which is just totally false. Voter registrations are public in Nebraska. This is something that I had multiple people point out to me while I was reporting, including my aunt, who loved to do famous "do your effing research" line with this, which is that the guy has been a registered independent his whole life. He has never run on the Democratic line. He, as far as I know, has never really had active affiliations with Democrats in any meaningful way. Has very successfully worked with Republicans in office, which in Nebraska, that's a feat. If you're a union leader who can work with Republicans to get them to support your strike, well, I'll be damned. And so it is just very wrong. There's nothing to it, but it has been hammered and hammered. And the way that these mailers work is the fact that it was reported and then not corrected for all that time means that the mailers are fair game. They're not going to run afoul of anything with the FEC. That has been the line over and over again. He is a registered Democrat, that he was a Democrat, that he's a Democrat in sheep's clothing. And there's really nothing to it. You can tell, at least I think I can tell where he lines up more neatly on issue positions. But the guy is not a Democrat. And I think in ways that matter, which is cultural cues, his willingness to talk about the Democratic Party in negative ways and name faults, you can tell that he hasn't spent a life building those relationships and favor arrangements. He just hasn't done any of that. It doesn't stick to him very easily.
And for any of those anxious Democrats who may be tuning into this, I would just say the fact that the National Republican Senate Council comms director is taking his time to attack Osborn is probably a good sign that he's not just going to become some sort of MAGA independent in Lincoln after beating Deb Fischer.
No, I think that there's a great chance that he defies expectations as far as who he ends up caucusing with. But I do think I would be shocked if he did anything even half as destructive as Joe Manchin. I think that insofar as he has leverage, he would wield it in novel ways, I think, maybe not neatly like caucusing or other things like that. But he's already said what he wants to do with his first priorities. Like if he was going to negotiate for parties, he said that he would negotiate for the PRO Act, that would be the thing that he would, that you could probably get his vote for important stuff like floor control if you promise to pass the PRO Act. Like it's just not the same. A union
he doesn't have a bunch of coal interests in West Virginia.
Right. Yeah.
He isn't doing massive dirty deals about actual dirty products.
Well, no, yeah. There's been this insane discourse about why is the left okay with this? Why do progressives seem to have this soft spot for Dan Osborn? I was like, well, why the hell do you think that we like the union leader more than the coal baron? Like, it's not that hard to figure out. You don't have to like skip to the most insane explanations. You can really just start with the simplest one.
And even like Cinema, who was sort of the academic, she wrote a book on necropolitics and was a Green Party person. Even her, like, I will say Osborn, out of the pick of those, comes from the background that I'm most comfortable with. And that's just you know, I guess we'll see how it stands. I hope he wins so that we can find out, because I think just everybody, what we should all agree on is ready to say goodbye to Deb Fischer.
Yeah. Well, on that, I mean, Austin, I don't want to put you in the position of having to make a hard prediction here, but I'm going to ask you one: are we going to look dumb next week, or how are we feeling about how this might look?
Well, I don't know. I just had to write my take on this race, and the thing about writing is that it's even worse than saying it on a podcast. And I stuck it as a podcast. In my gut, I think that I felt at the time that he had an advantage. I don't know how I feel now. I don't think that anybody's going to look dumb, because I don't think that if he loses, it's going to be by a lot. I think it would be single digits. It's still going to be the best performance statewide by anybody that doesn't have a Republican next to their name. And I think it's very safe to say that he does a better job and overperforms way more than like the Greg Ormans or the Al Grossens of years past, these other independent type candidates. So I think we could look a lot cooler than we otherwise would next week if he pulls it out. But I really don't think that there's a disaster scenario where we have to go back to the drawing board. I think a lot of this is baked in, and it's proven by the fact that he's just to the very finish line overperforming.
Well, Austin Ahlman, we'll link to the piece in the Prospect, or the American Prospect, in the show notes. Anywhere else people should follow you?
I'm on Twitter. Otherwise, do subscribe to the Open Markets Institute. If you like labor populism, if you like anti-corporate politics, we're a great organization for you.
Thanks a bunch, Austin.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here. It's just me today, which is good because we actually are breaking from tradition and have two guests to be talking this really exciting new edition of Capital. This translation up here. We'll have a link below for people to find it. We're joined by Paul Reitter and Paul North, who collaborated on bringing this new text. Bringing this text, a retranslation of this text. If y'all could just introduce yourself so people can know your voice and what your background is, that'd be really wonderful. Maybe we can start with you, Paul North.
I teach critical theory. I'm at Yale University, and I studied literature and philosophy.
I'm Paul Reitter, and I teach German and translation at German language and literature and culture, not so much German language, and translation at Ohio State University.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to be talking about this new translation of Capital Volume 1. And I know this is probably how every interview starts, but we have to ask it. What was the motivation to dive back into this text and provide this retranslation, this new translation?
Well, first of all, this is the best basis for understanding the capital system, still, even after 150 years. So it's still absolutely relevant. It's current. It's a good place. It's a better place than any to start. It's the most thorough investigation, even though capitalism has developed quite a bit. So there's no question that it's a book that needs to be read.
And in addition to that, it's funny and charming and full of pathos and interesting literary references and all kinds of other things that make it a great read, despite its moments of difficulty. There's no point in trying to sweep them under the rug. And we both felt that the existing English translations didn't quite do justice to the work, which isn't to dismiss them. They have their merits for sure, but there were important aspects of the work we felt that didn't get preserved very effectively. It's actually quite astonishing that there were only 2 in-print editions of this work that is, of such vast historical importance. And when you think about it like that, then the question becomes more like, well, why hasn't somebody done this yet? This is kind of strange. And we didn't know about anybody else planning to do it. So we thought, okay, well, why not us?
Well, I mean, I think, I found the translation, and I don't read German, but I found the translation to be really refreshing. And, I really do want to talk a bit about that art, because I find that to be really interesting. But just on the kind of broad question of capital, it's one of those things as somebody who does this program on YouTube, you get a lot of different folks when you put Marx or capital or capitalism in a video title. You get Marxists and socialists, but I also think there's a large part of the U.S. population that's kind of interested in what these books are that sort of seem, taboo or outside of the, the mainstream. I think an unfortunate thing is there's now a kind of right-wing cottage industry that's set up to describe what these texts are that usually doesn't have a very strong understanding of them. So for someone who maybe has never, only understands capital by reputation, how would you describe this book, and maybe something that might be surprising to somebody who has never picked it up before and is less familiar with Marx's work?
Well, I could say a couple of things, and then I know Paul will have things to say. If you wonder why you work so hard but you don't get ahead, this book tells you why. If you wonder why some people have all of the resources and the vast majority of people don't have them, and have a diminishing amount of them, this book tells you why. If you wonder why other modes of living where people, share their resources don't take hold, this book tells you why. If you wonder why capitalism is spreading into all corners of the globe, it also tells you why. This is why it's a threat to the right, at least the right that supports market ideologies. But it really should be read by the right as well.
As to what's surprising about the book, I think that readers will be surprised given what is said about Marx, and not simply by anti-Marxists, but also influential, sympathetic commentators like Isaiah Berlin, for example, whose biography of Marx is still in print and still widely read. It was published in 1940. He's extremely eloquent, famous intellectual historian and essayist. He says about Marx's thinking that it was a closed system and that everything had its particular place there. And one of the points about Marx that's been emphasized recently in Marx scholarship is how much in progress his work was, how he was constantly revising things. And there are ways in which you can see in Capital that his ideas are in motion. There's some terminological shifts. He kept revising his terminology that can actually make things a little bit difficult. But you also see just how openly. He was thinking through everything. And so when he talks about technology, for example, and the effect of technology on the worker, that it has made their situation worse in these ways, and it puts pressure on capital in these ways. But at the same time, capital has managed to find ways around some of these pressures that technology creates. So one big point that comes across in the book, I think more than people might expect, because they think of it as a book that's diagnosing the terminal contradictions in capitalism, is how adaptable capitalism is. But then at the same time, there are all these individual insights about the countercurrents or the countervailing trends. So technology destroys the family by bringing women and children into the workplace as they hadn't been brought in before. But then at the same time, that does promote a certain gender equality that's potentially beneficial. There's so many ways in which he's going back and forth, and he is just there are big points and big ideas, but there are also many little subtle insights that you get that go in different directions and cumulatively leave you with the impression of just this incredible openness and receptivity to different kinds of things happening at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way to put it. Actually, I think some folks who have never read it, even people who might be sympathetic to Marx, I think it's just a long list of all of the problems that Marx saw with capital. And certainly, there's a bit of that in there, but that probably isn't a very holistic way to view it. I mean, let's talk a little bit about like this process of translating it. I mean, could y'all let the audience know what y'all's roles were in producing this?
Well, I did the translation, but Paul was a co-editor, which means that he sort of did the translation too, but in a more of a destructive way. I would say I did it in a constructive way, meaning I would send things to Paul and then he would tear them down and I would build them back up. I'm joking. Paul did give me a lot of extremely valuable critical feedback on the translation. He actually also came up with some really great phrases, and unfortunately, he's not credited for that. That just doesn't really quite seem to be a practice in translation. But I think
Reitter is like the translation version of a capitalist. He takes all the credit for himself.
Yes. I think theological quibbles and metaphysical quirks in the fetish section comes from Paul. So it was very collaborative, but generally speaking, I would produce translation, send it to Paul, and he would point out things that he thought didn't work, and we would have discussions about this, and that was the fun part of the project.
And we got an education. I have to say, working this close with such an amazing text taught me so much about my life and my world, why I'm so exhausted, for example, from overwork. Really was the best kind of education. I recommend retranslating Marx's Capital to anybody.
Yeah, there's something neat about working really, really hard on a project that's all about hard work and people not being paid for their labor. It was its own therapy.
Well, before we get into some of the kind of political considerations too, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the German, particularly for non-German speakers. What was something that you might have felt was either being missed or maybe not being appreciated about the way that Marx writes and the way that he argues in the original German that might not have been as clear in some of the previous translations? And also, sorry, and just really quick too, like, for somebody who doesn't speak German at all or is unfamiliar with it, I mean, grammatically, logically, what are some kind of notes that somebody even with the translation as rich as this should maybe be considering about, about the differences between these two languages, English and German?
Let me say a couple of things about the translation. Reitter is very eloquent about the differences between German and English. I got to watch this translation unfold in his amazing linguistic workshop. what's special about Capital is it has many different styles. Marx was not satisfied to just, I don't know, say something or just to analyze something. He tells stories about how it got that way. He ventriloquizes the worker. He speaks in the place of a capitalist, making them look pretty ridiculous. There's a lot of jokes. It's ironic. And a lot of the text is written in a very direct fashion, which was unusual for German scholarly writing of the day. And most of those things get lost in the previous translations, which have kind of one translation tack. And what's beautiful about this one, and Reitter was able to do it because of his work in German literature and other German theory, was to be flexible in the style and to really bring the multiplicity of Marx's styles to an English reader.
Well, thank you, Paul, for saying those nice things about the translation. There are a lot of challenges that readers wouldn't be aware of if they don't know much about German or have any direct experience of the language or Marx's German in particular. German is famous for its long sentences and its long words, but in fact, one of the big challenges here was how compressed Marx's writing often is. It's just more normal, sounds less stilted and stylized in German to have a one-word sentence. And Marx was very concerned with rhythm and cadence, and so he'll have longer sentences, and then he'll have just a one-word sentence, and okay, you can sort of do that in English, but it doesn't sound quite right. It doesn't seem to match the rhythm that Marx is producing there, so you have to extend it a little. But you're always wary of extension when you're doing the translation. Translated texts tend to be longer than the original texts because often you're adding a little bit of context that the audience, by nature different from the original audience, will need to have in order to understand the text. And so that was a big challenge. Marx really he also likes to drop words when he can. If a word is implied, he won't use it. German, which has gendered nouns and there are more inflected case endings, allows for compression in a way that English doesn't. You can keep using pronouns in German. You can't just keep saying it in English. Readers will get lost. And so, this may not sound like the most important thing for people, and I'm not suggesting that it was the most important thing for me either. I may have probably did spend more time on some terminological choices that will be perhaps a more prominent part of the reading experience, since this is what you're thinking about when you're thinking about Marx, these key Marxian terms, not necessarily Marxian rhythms and compression, and yet these things were a big part of the translation experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, on that and considering, so, there's like two aspects here, right? Is like trying to be faithful to like the intention of Marx, but also, I mean, you all don't live in a vacuum. We now have a huge history of thought around Marxism, debates, both within Marxism, outside of Marxism. So how did y'all sort of negotiate, the question of incorporating or not incorporating contemporary debates, right? Were y'all trying to shut yourself out of everything that's happened over the past, 100 years and imagine you were just, capturing this text now, or were y'all bringing that, that perspective into the text and the translation as well?
One thing you could say is that we're the first people to attack a translation and edition who are scholars. So to ask us to shut out all the scholarship just goes against our nature. But in fact, this book is part of a very long project that Marx undertook starting in the mid-1850s, going all the way through, and he was thinking about it up till his death. So about 30 years of work on political economy, on the capital system. And this book has been calculated to be about 1/72nd of the capital project. And nobody understood that really deeply until the last 30 years or so. So the previous translation really didn't think of these books as being part of a much bigger project, developing a whole set of bigger thoughts, this volume 1 being only one small part of it. We really took much of that into account. You can never claim to have read everything, but we really read thousands of pages of Marx criticism and some strands of that criticism, particularly value theory, which came to understand what Marx was doing with the idea of value. Value is the main subject of Volume 1, and value is that dominating force that makes us all, including the capitalists, go to work and do what we have to do, advance our capital or produce our commodities. It's the value form that is the really commanding presence in the capital system. And a lot of work has been done on that since the 70s. And we used that to try to understand the vocabulary around value so that people could understand what's oppressing them.
It's surprising, I suppose, for someone coming to this from the outside without much experience of historical debates in Marxism, that something so central in the text, value, which Marx right away tells you is at the center of things, that something so central would actually not have played such a central role in a lot of Marx scholarship, figuring out exactly what Marx is talking about here, because it's not easy to know. This is something that Marx did keep revising, and there was a lot of movement from the first edition of Capital in 1867 to the second edition of Capital, and that's the source text that we used, 1872, the last German edition of the book that Marx himself oversaw. There was a lot of movement around this language of value. Very significant terminological shifts, and that tells you that Marx was figuring it out himself, and we drew, as Paul said, very heavily on recent scholarship around value theory. We're very grateful to some of the people producing this scholarship, in particular Michael Heinrich, for his support and enthusiasm for the project, and we had a lot of great conversations with him. He has an unbelievable endurance for answering questions from people like us, and we are so thankful for that. And that was another fun part of the project, getting to know people like Michael and to draw on their expertise and interact with them. I'm sure, Marx, people who identify with Marx are very often quite critical. Marx himself had, obviously these very critical tendencies, prided himself on this, and one way of identifying with Marx is to display that kind of thing and just categorically criticize whatever comes your way. And so we know that, and this is not to suggest that we don't deserve criticism either, but it's a critical crowd out there, and we expect to get our quite a bit of criticism, hopefully productive, constructive criticism that we can learn from Marx readers. But what I'm building up to here is that the community of Marx scholars, which we were not really a part of when we started this project, they were incredibly welcoming and generous and supportive with us. And as I said, that was another fun part of the project, getting to know people there and to work with people.
I'm sure. Well, sorry, not to bring drama in here, and we don't have to name names or anything, but I have seen it said that this translation is an attempt to turn the revolutionary Marx into a kind of pedestrian social democrat. And I'm just curious if y'all have any response about some of these claims that I have seen floating around by some folks, that like this is an attempt to sort of defang Marxism, and to take that revolutionary bite out of it. And I'm just curious if y'all have any response to that.
No. That's the first response. No. The second response is also no. But the revolutionary bite is in the analysis of that the book presents, and what our aim was to give was to give people access to the analysis of the capital system. It's not an anti-revolutionary book, but it's not revolutionary in the way the Communist Manifesto was. It is not a call to action. It's a call to understanding. And these days, it's a call to understand a system where the traditional modes of revolution, let's say the 19th century modes or 18th century modes, they don't seem applicable anymore, given the way capitalism has spread out over the globe, given the way it's entrenched itself, given the way it's become financialized, etc. And so there's no reason to draw the conclusion that this is a social democratic approach to the book. Nobody ever says that. What we do is emphasize the kind of book it is. It is a critique of political economy and an analysis of the capital system that should give people who want to make change the pointers to the best places to make that change.
I would add that I understand that we're low-hanging fruit. The book came out with Princeton University Press, not Verso. We're academics, Germanists at well-established American universities. We don't have a history of activism. I can understand why people, or it would be surprising rather, I should say, if people didn't level the kinds of criticisms that you're talking about. And I'm not really around on social media, so I heard about this kind of thing from other people, but haven't encountered it so directly. My response is, okay, you find the framing a little off-putting because it doesn't foreground the revolutionary Marx. Well, read the translation, read the notes. Tell me if you think that anything there goes to de-emphasize Marx's radicality, goes to try to make him into a milder critic of the capital system than he actually was. I haven't heard of anything like that so far.
Yeah, and I will say that most of these criticisms I find, are strikingly absent of like actual problems with like the translation or something like that. So I'd be curious to hear that a little bit more in a thorough way. But the last thing I want to ask just on that is, one of the decisions I remember listening to y'all speaking with Doug Henwood about this was about whether or not to like personalize the capital versus like capitalist. And I'm curious if you could sort of speak about that, because I found that to be a very interesting point that I find, a lot of times I think radicals and revolutionaries, they really do want to personalize these kind of systems, right? Which I find can be a little bit of a mistake if you're talking about a systemic critique. If you're saying that like, well, people just have bad souls or bad hearts, then it doesn't sound as much of a systemic critique. But I'm just curious if y'all could talk about that decision as it played out in this translation.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's in a way part of a larger issue having to do in part with the differences between German and English. I talk about this a bit in the translator's preface, and I think I may have talked about it with Doug as well, about how German compared to English is a personifying language where you pair inanimate things with reflexive verbs and active verbs in a way that is much less common in German and in English, excuse me. And so this is, if you're not watching out for this, a German to English translation winds up sounding strangely personifying. And, that can be fine. I mean, if you're trying to give people a sense of what is going on in the German, which is a legitimate translation goal, rather than putting a text into natural sounding English, okay, great. But with Marx, there is this important complication, which is that he is trying to make the case that agency in capitalism gets turned upside down in all kinds of ways. And it's very important for him then that things play roles that people generally play, and people are put in roles that usually belong to things. And so you want to be very careful about this personification so that the programmatic moments of personification are legible as such. And I think that choice of capital and having capital rather than the capitalist doing things that, again, people usually do, that this is an important moment of personification in the text. This is Marx saying that this is a system that, yes, people created and yes, needs the involvement of people to function, but that ultimately controls people more than people control it.
And it raises a question about revolutionary activity, which had come to Marx after doing a lot of revolutionary activity and participating in revolutions that failed to achieve their goals in Europe at the time, which is, how do you overcome an abstract machine like capital, without which everyone would starve? So everyone is linked to this machine. It's providing them with their goods. It's also producing the relationships of domination that are driving the vast majority of the population down. How do you overcome that? That's the question that the whole book raises, even though it doesn't have an answer.
Well, I think that might be, leaving on that kind of question mark, there might be a good place to leave it. Paul Reitter and Paul North, thank y'all so much for joining us on Left Reckoning. Y'all can find this new translation. I highly suggest it. It's been really fun diving back into it. We'll have a link below for people to get their hands on it. And really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. This was very fun.
I agree. That was. I actually have that new translation on Audible. I've been telling David, I've been meaning to get to it. I've been in a gonzo, Gonzo mode.
Gonzo way.
In a fear and loathing mode. You can probably guess why. That was a very good introduction and sort of package to sort of whet the appetite for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do suggest people pick it up. It's really interesting, and I've been enjoying listening to their interviews with me and with other folks. It's been really cool for revisiting the text. I said I had meant to ask, but it just sort of didn't feel natural. I want to talk a little bit about the AI machine and translation with them, because that is something to consider. Like, I think it is really great in a lot of ways to be able to get a rough translation of maybe a news article or a message from somebody, even if you don't share the same language. But translation is a real art, and it's a lot more than just sort of taking an input and getting an output.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a touchy thing, because I think in the raw, like seeing, say, the Chapo guys get translated into Mandarin, or like Xi Jinping get translated to English, for instance. And that stuff's very interesting, even though like I know to take it with a massive grain of salt. The problem is a lot of people don't, right? And like I've heard horrible stories about like medical professionals being like, okay, I have to remember some sort of like formula or some sort of dosage thing, and looking in the AI response gives you something completely made up. So I kind of lost my thought there, but yeah, the AI would be interesting, because ultimately, I saw that. That's what I was going to say is Google recently said, their CEO, that a good chunk, like I think 15 to 20% of their code now is originally produced by AI and then checked by people. That's just Boeing of the internet. If you're telling me, like, that is a recipe for absolute disaster if that is true, and not just them trying to justify AI investment.
No, exactly. Well, folks, you're not going to want to miss this post game. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get access to it. Matt and I are going to take some questions from y'all, talk a little bit more about the election. We have a very interesting new theological segment that Matt's been working hard on.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins, the Dawkins versus Peterson debate is here, folks, and it really, you got to see it to believe it.
I'm really looking forward to that. And also reminding folks, we're going to be, next week's going to be a little different. Tuesday, I'll probably pop on for a stream for just a little bit at some point on Tuesday night, but we're going to have our main show on Wednesday, the day after the election, which will be nice because we'll have the dust settle a little bit, have a stronger sense of what's going on versus just sort of sitting around and being like, oh, is Ohio coming yet? Oh, has Pennsylvania come in yet? I don't know. It can be a little dry. Sorry, Matt. But if you are a patron, $10 and above, don't forget Wednesday around 4 Central, we're going to be having a large group call with our patrons to talk about the election, to talk about what y'all's thoughts are about where the program should go in whatever the next reality is. So you're not going to want to miss it. And if you aren't a patron and you aren't at that level, it's a good time to jump up, patreon.com/left reckoning for all of that. But we're going to be over in the post game in just about 10 minutes or so. So you'll find that link. Come and join us and learn a thing or two about God.